In 1923, a group of the world's most successful businessmen met at the Edgewater Beach Hotel in Chicago. In the group were the president of the largest steel corporation, the greatest wheat speculator, a man who was president of the New York Stock Exchange, a member of the president's cabinet, the shrewdest investor on Wall Street, the future director of the World Bank, and the head of the world's largest monopoly. They would have been atop the Forbes richest 100 people list if there would have been one at the time, all of them meeting together. And a few years later, this was their fate. Charles Schwab died in debt. Arthur Cutten died in obscurity. Richard Whitney became insolvent and did time in Sing Sing prison. Albert Fall was pardoned from prison so that he could go home to die. And Jesse Livermore, Leon Fraser, and Ivar Kruger, the Match King, all took their own lives. All of them learned how to make money, but none of them learned how to live. In 1930, at the height of the Depression, Charles Schwab said, "I'm afraid. We're all afraid. I don't know. We don't know what the values we have are. We don't know whether they're going to be real next month or not." I heard on NPR this week that the consumer spending index ticked up by 0.3% in the month of June. That reminded me that our country and most of the world measures success by consumption. When consumption decreases, we go into a recession, which is another way of saying that we're not spending enough money on stuff. If we don't buy more stuff, then businesses are going to fail and salaries will dry up and we won't be able to buy more stuff. So I guess you could say that our country is counting on us building bigger barns. And Jesus calls all of this greed. I like the Greek word better because I'm less familiar with it. Pleonexia. It's the insatiable desire for more. It's what Jesus senses in the man who interrupts him while he's talking to a crowd of people about fear. Do not fear those who kill the body, Jesus is saying to thousands who have come to hear him preach. Do not worry about how you will defend yourself or what you will say, because the Holy Spirit will teach you at that time what you ought to say. That's what Jesus is talking about, how to address our fears of not having enough. And right then, someone in the crowd interrupts him to ask for his help in settling an estate, because he's afraid he doesn't have enough. There are at least 2 brothers involved, and the executor is apparently dragging his feet. "Teacher," the man says, "tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But Jesus, he won't do it. Not because he's uninterested in justice, but he senses that he will never fix what is broken inside of this man. While Jesus is talking about fear, this guy is so afraid that his mind went immediately to what he thought would make him safer, namely, getting his hands on his inheritance. But Jesus knew that that would never work, which was his opening to tell this parable about a rich fool. Now, it's important, I think, to remember that this rich fool was just that, a fool. He wasn't a crook. Certainly, he was self-absorbed because he asked himself questions, answered those questions, and then congratulated himself on his good sense. But at least we could say he came by his treasure honestly. He lucked out one year with his crops, and then he was willing to work hard to protect what he had been given, all so that he could take early retirement. So what did make him a fool? You've probably heard at least some of these answers before. He was a fool because he was greedy, or because he was self-centered, or because he didn't distribute his abundant wealth. He was a fool because he thought life would be complete once he had his treasure tucked up in a brand new barn. He was a fool because he thought he would have years to enjoy it. But you know, the problem with all of those answers is that they stir up ultimately a sense of either guilt or fear. And Jesus isn't that kind of preacher. So I want to try out a different possible answer, which is that this rich man was a fool because his quest for treasure was too limited. His sense of purpose was simply too small. To put it another way, this man simply wasn't rich enough. Or as the front of the bulletin says today, some people are so poor, all they have is money. This man had fallen for the myth that accumulating stuff is a big enough purpose for our lives. But that's simply not true. He dreamed of the day when he could say to himself, "You have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry." But you know, the relaxing part never seemed to come, because it was so hard to know when he had achieved the plenty part. Where treasure is concerned, it's always a real challenge for us to decide how much is enough. That's the question I want you to reflect on this week. How much is enough? And I'm not just talking about how much stuff or how much money is enough, but how much love, how much mercy, how much forgiveness is enough. Because the grace in this text is knowing that when it comes to being rich toward God, we never need to worry about having enough of God's grace and love. Notice, Jesus never says what it means to be rich toward God in the parable. The parable he tells the inheritance-minded brother is not designed to solve his problem, but simply to let him know that he has one, and to empty his hands of his present treasure so that he's free to receive the priceless gift of grace and love and forgiveness that God offers. I think each one of us have a different purpose in our lives, a different way of being rich toward God. Yes, some people might need to quit a soul-deadening job and find work that's richer in purpose. But most of us could wake up to the purpose that's already available to us in our lives right now if we don't already know it. And don't fall into the trap of thinking that what you do is small change in God's pocket. Because as far as I can tell, there's no such thing. We all know the world is in need of mending. Just look at the news yesterday. Shootings in now Dayton, Ohio, and El Paso, Texas. The world is in need of mending, and no stitch is too small. As discerning Christians, we've been discovering for over 2,000 years, it's possible to mop floors and clean toilets out of love for God. It's just as possible to care for a child or roof a house or work for justice for the oppressed or simply be a listening friend and encounter the love of God. I think that's what Luther was getting at when he was talking about our vocation. We know it's our vocation, our calling in life, when the richness of God's love surpasses our fear. The important thing is to sense how your life and God's life are flowing in the same direction. And if you're clear that they're not, then do something about it. Find a purpose here at church or in the larger community that helps you be rich toward God as soon as you can. One that helps God mend the world one stitch at a time and mends you while you're at it. Until then, if you have to be greedy for love. Be greedy for justice and compassion and God's purpose for your life. That way there won't be any doubt that God, whose giving knows no ending, has already made you very rich indeed. Amen.